Hi, everyone, and welcome to Chalkbeat's event on Pennsylvania's graduation pathways. I'm Carly Citron. I'm the bureau chief over at Chalkbeat Philly. Chalkbeat is a nonprofit news organization covering the story of education in America. That work includes chronicling decisions made by state lawmakers that impact the lives of teachers and students, which is why we're so happy to host this conversation today. Be sure to sign up for Chalkbeat's free email newsletter if you haven't already to continue following our coverage of high school success. That should land in your inbox first thing tomorrow morning if you sign up. We'll provide a link in the chat to do so. I want to mention that this conversation will be recorded and emailed to all attendees afterward. The chat box is closed, but please use the Q&A box on Zoom to submit your questions for our panel or to let us know about any technical issues you might be having. Great. So I'm now going to hand it off to our moderator, Rebecca, to introduce herself and our panelists. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Carly, and hi, everyone. Yeah, so glad you're all here. So excited to have this conversation. I am Rebecca Rettelmeyer. I'm the Chalkbeat Philly reporter, and we are joined today by some great panelists. I'm going to introduce them briefly. We have Monica Hawk. She's the CEO of One Bright Ray Community High School in Philly, which runs several accelerated high schools in the city. We have Matt Gianni, a research associate professor at the University of Texas at Austin, who has studied high school students' post-graduation pathways and has awesome research to share with us today. And we have Sean Vereen, the CEO of Heights Philadelphia, which works with students in many Philly schools to promote high school success and post-grad success. So I'm really excited to just get into this conversation with the panelists, but before I do, I just want to set the scene for us a little bit so we all kind of know what's happening with graduation and post-grad and pathways here in Philly. So around 4 years ago, Pennsylvania overhauled its graduation requirements. A new law was passed, and there were new requirements. Since then, what we know is that graduation rates in Philly and statewide have improved, and everyone has celebrated that. It's great. Grad rates are going up. But what we don't know is whether students are really any better off after graduation. We don't know if they're, learning more, if they're more equipped for what comes next. There isn't much to say on that yet from the state or the district. And in the meantime, what we've seen is that scores on state math and reading tests have gone down or stayed the same. So there isn't much improvement over there. Under the new graduation requirements, students still have to pass their classes, but they also need to complete one of 5 pathways to show they're ready for college or careers. Some of those pathways do require students to earn certain scores on standardized tests, but in Philly and in many other districts, the most popular pathway is nothing to do with academic performance. It's called the evidence-based pathway, and it hinges on students presenting 3 pieces of evidence that they're ready to graduate from a state-approved list. So in practice, kind of what it means is that a student can take a couple of quick online courses to earn something called an industry recognized credential, and then they're dubbed graduation ready. Those credentials can be like a workplace safety certification, a medical assistant certification, a ladder safety certification. They really span a wide range. So today we're going to dig into the implications of that new system, and we're going to look at some national context as well, because Pennsylvania is one of several states that has recently undergone this kind of graduation overhaul. And it's also one of many states that's encouraging students to earn these industry recognized credentials without much oversight into what those credentials are. So that's where we're at. And I want to start out by asking Monica, because you work with Philly students every day, you're there trying to support students to get to graduation. Can you walk us through what these new graduation requirements look like, how it works at your school?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to represent the Opportunity Network of the School District of Philadelphia. So a little bit about the organization that I run at One Bright Ray Community High Schools. We serve students who are at least a year and a half behind on credits. So they are overaged, undercredited students. So a lot of times my students have dropped out of high school already or are in danger of dropping out, and they're behind in academically. And so we bring them into our school, and we are an accelerated model of school. and also support them with a variety of supports in each building to get them to graduate. So we have a very unique population, students who have not found success in traditional schools. So I'm coming at this from a very unique lens, also in that we have the first graduates of every class. For instance, the class of 2026, which we are in now, our first cohort graduates in November of each year. So October 1st starts the class of 2026, and by November, we already have the first graduates in the city of Philadelphia. So when this graduation pathway rolled out, we had to be on our game. And so we started before the School District of Philadelphia even started, really thinking through our students and knowing that our students have struggled academically and are behind. Traditionally, our students struggle on standardized tests. A lot of them have test aversion. And so we knew, especially with our accelerated model of getting students in and out of our program within 2 years with a high school diploma, we had to focus on this safety net of the evidence-based pathway. So we really focused on how can we get our students evidence towards post-secondary readiness and still push them for the keystones. We still want them to be proficient on keystone exams. Everyone does, but this is just our safety net. And to really make sure that our students know that there's value in these pieces of evidence. But then when you look at the pieces of evidence that can be allowed on the evidence-based pathway, there's also some inaccessibility there, right? When we think about which school districts or which schools might have students with the lowest keystone proficiency rates, there's also an economic component to that. They're also very typically the underfunded schools and students who cannot afford necessarily these industry recognized credentials, which can have a cost to each one. So we really had to figure out, what does that look like for us? What are we going to provide to everyone, regardless of what they want to do after high school? And then what are some ways that we can really individualize this for students? And that is a tricky task, which I'm sure we'll dive into.
Yeah, before we move on, Monica, I just want to ask, like, say you're working with a student, like, what are kind of the options you present them? Like,
Absolutely.
Mhm.
So we put all of our students into an OSHA 10 certification course, because that's talking about workplace safety. And all of our students are focused on getting jobs, or they have part-time jobs. And so we know that this will also, we tell them, if two students your age go and apply for a job and you have an OSHA certification and they don't, you're automatically a better candidate because you know about workplace safety. And so we put everyone in an OSHA 10 course. We also have college and career counselors at each campus who talk to our students about what they want to do after high school. And so based on that, we try to find industry recognized credentials or service learning projects or things like that that really coincide with which career cluster they have chosen after high school. So it's really we try to tailor it to the student's needs individually and also make it cost effective. And that's the tricky part.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's tricky because we know, like, some of the healthcare credentials, like, they're really expensive, or some of the
Yeah,
manufacturing credentials, you like need certain equipment and stuff to like even get that, versus something
exactly.
like OSHA 10 could be like a course anyone could take.
And that's still a cost. I mean, One Bright Ray has spent $46,000 in the past 3 years on OSHA 10 certifications for our students because we don't fall under the School District of Philadelphia for them paying for it. We have to pay for it for ourselves. And so that's an expense that we have chosen because we think it's really beneficial for our students to understand workplace safety for themselves and others. And it makes them more marketable as employees, no matter what field they go into. And then we also focus on different career paths for students as well.
Got it. So, Matt, I want to ask you about how this ties into what you're seeing nationally, especially with students earning credentials to show their graduation ready. Yeah, how much of what's going on in Philly do you see elsewhere?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Also, pleasure to be here. So thanks for the opportunity. Um, I won't say that I'm a Philly expert by any means, but from everything I've learned about the state policy changes and from your reporting, Rebecca, it seems like Philly is really a microcosm of what's happening across the country and in a number of states where I'm doing research. I've done a lot of my research in Texas, but Ohio, Indiana, multiple other states as well. And I think there's a couple big factors that are at play that are kind of shaping the current moment that we're in. I mean, first, it's just really important to emphasize this really dramatic shift from college readiness to college and career readiness, right? And that's an evolutionary process over the past decade, but from federal policy and the Every Student Succeeds Act and the reauthorization of the Perkins CTE legislation to state accountability changes, to changes in graduation requirements, many states and localities are in the midst of this shift of thinking about the one strategy for students is to prepare them for college. And we're going to think about the indicators of college readiness to thinking about a broader portfolio of indicators that might also signify students' preparedness for careers. And I think that shift is driven by a lot of things, questioning the value of higher education, the growing costs of college, the fact that many students who go to college don't complete a degree, which raises questions about ROI, so on and so forth, right? So many states are in the midst of this shift. I think at the same time, there's also a growing body of research suggesting that there's many middle skills jobs that don't require a bachelor's degree that can still provide family sustaining wages, that are great occupations, that come with lots of training and professional growth opportunities. So there's also thinking about how do we kind of develop these new pathways. Of course, also, I think we have to mention COVID and learning loss and all of the incredible disruptions that happened during the past few years in education. And at a time when schools were thinking about how do we prepare students for college and career and what indicators can we hit, students' test scores were dropping, their ability to complete AP exams was dropping, their ability to take dual credit courses was going away because of, shift to remote learning and so forth. So schools were in a position where they had to prepare students for college and career, but many of the other indicators at their disposal for doing that were kind of disappearing, or at least their capacity to help students hit those indicators of college readiness was diminished by those social forces. And then, of course, states have factored industry certifications into educational policy in a variety of ways, right? So in places like Texas, the accountability system changed, where the way in which we hold schools accountable really shifted from that college readiness approach to college and career readiness, where if a student earns an industry certification, they are considered career ready and they check the college and career ready box. And the grade that is assigned to the school in the accountability system is directly related to the proportion of students checking that box and hitting that indicator, right? There's also financial incentives that many states have implemented where schools get additional cash or reimbursements for those costs of the certifications, right? So there's like funding mechanisms that have promoted students' receipt of the certifications. And I think one thing to note is that a lot of times states will produce a list and treat them all as equivalent. So a certification that might take a year for students to earn and require them to complete a bunch of college level courses and have a practicum component and be really, really robust might be the same as a 60-minute online multiple choice assessment that students can go through. So from the perspective of schools, my research generally suggests that schools are being very rational given the current policy and funding environment, and they're finding the most efficient ways to help students demonstrate college and career readiness. And oftentimes that safety net that Monica just mentioned is having students earn these certifications, right? And in places like Texas, some of those, the most common are Microsoft Word, are floral design, are the ones where you can go online and complete them fairly quickly. So this is really something that's happening across the country, across districts, and in many schools. I think I will also say that schools and states are learning about how to do this better, right? I think we've learned from some mistakes along the way, which includes thinking about variation in quality and kind of rigor of the certifications and thinking about a tiered system that might differentiate that value. Not having systems that are college or career readiness indicators where they are substitutes for each other, but thinking about them as supplements where you still need those foundational academic skills, but then these certifications are like a bonus or an add-on on top of that rather than a substitute. So states are starting to realize that there's some unintended consequences of the way the IBC policy was designed, and they're starting to move in slightly different directions to kind of tamp down on some of the less savory outcomes of the emphasis on IBCs, I'd say.
Yeah, so fascinating that like this it's not just Philly and it's you see it in different pockets elsewhere. Before I want to just ask you also about if what kind of equity concerns you've seen in your research. Which kind of students are we talking about who are getting the floral skills or the ladder safety?
Yeah, it's a really, really great question, and we have some new research that we hope to release in the near future about this. I'll say when we first looked at IBC attainment and like what factors are associated with IBC attainment, we actually didn't see very stark disparities by race, ethnicity, by gender, by socioeconomic background. Once you controlled for like the CTE courses students took and their prior achievement, they had roughly equivalent likelihood of earning any IBC. And that was somewhat surprising to us just because we find inequity so often when we do research in education. I was like, oh, that's interesting. Texas just put all their IBCs into tiers, tier one, tier two, tier three. And they retired a bunch of IBCs that they found were not strongly related to students' post-secondary outcomes. In our most recent research, what we're finding is starker patterns of inequity when looking at the types of IBCs students are earning. So the retired IBCs, which were the ones that were most often used to kind of game the system and just kind of pump out credentials that weren't actually aligned with students' post-secondary aspirations or labor market outcomes, and the tier three certifications that are like the lowest value in TEA's design, the Texas Education Agency's design, excuse me. Those are the certifications that are earned at much higher rates by students of color, low-income students, and even women. So for the first time, we are seeing some of those patterns of inequity more starkly. And I think students from underserved backgrounds who don't have as many resources might be encouraged or inclined to have those safety nets, while students who are high performing, who are prepared for college, whatever, it might not be emphasized as much. So we don't have a lot of evidence, I would say, across the field, but we're starting to see a little bit come out that's raising important equity concerns about IBC policy for sure.
Yeah, fascinating. So, I mean, with this kind of like graduation overhaul context, something that I've been mulling about, and I'm curious, Monica and Matt, what you think, like, is it useful to have these additional graduation requirements? Is it benefiting students? So, what do you think?
I do think there's intention behind this idea. And I think, kind of like what Matt said, we used to be a college only push. And now having students understand that there are other ways to successfully provide for yourself and your family is really beneficial. And so changing the framing of what high school is for and what it's preparing us for is really beneficial. I would love um, more intentionality in practice, right? Because it does become much more kind of like what Matt was saying, it's become more of a checkbox system, right? Do I have students who have met the requirements? Yes. Versus is it really intentional and purposeful and meaningful to them in their career? And I think we could do a better job of that with the funding and the equity and the time frame. And I love the tiers idea, Matt, that you're saying that Texas has done. It's really smart.
Yeah, I'll just say that I agree with all of that. If a student wants to be a licensed vocational nurse, they need a license. If they want to be a cosmetologist, they need a license. If they want to be a commercial truck driver, they need a license. If they want to be a mechanic, then getting the automotive service excellence certifications or some equivalent is really beneficial, right? Not required in the same way that a license is, but still beneficial. So I think there's a lot of these industry certifications that are absolutely either stepping stones that can like help you advance in your career, or sometimes they're like legal requirements where you can't work in an occupation unless you get this type of certification. So absolutely, I think they can be really beneficial. I think it's kind of separating the wheat from the chaff, right? And in the defense of states across the country, they didn't have a lot of data on the relationship between students' receipt of these certifications and their post-secondary outcomes when they were deciding which certifications to include in the approved lists. So they're going on expert recommendations, talking to industry representatives, talking to businesses, looking at occupational projections, and doing the best that they could to try to guess which certifications are actually aligned and will benefit students in the labor market. The problem is, like in Texas, if 40,000 students earn a floral design certification, that is no longer a very strong signal because now you're competing with 40,000 other students who have the same credential as you. Is it actually going to help you get a job as a florist? How many of these students actually want to be florists, right? Probably not very many. So I think over time, we're learning which are the certifications that are more strongly and reliably associated with students' transitions into the labor market or even higher education, and which ones maybe were a good idea in theory, but in practice, they're not working the way that we intended. And we need to just refine the list, refine the graduation requirements, refine the policy to kind of maximize the benefits and minimize the risks to students.
Got it. And Sean, I want to get into like all the work Heights does, but before I do, like from your vantage point, what are you seeing and thinking about? Are these kind of requirements useful?
I think this on two levels. I think, on one, we want to think about employers, really. So what are employers actually looking at as opposed to sort of having an intellectual conversation about this, sounds good in theory, I think as Matt was talking about versus what employers really look at, so we're having conversations with hospitals, we're having conversations, there's a big push around shipbuilding in Philadelphia. And again, when adults talk about these things, it's like, hey, this is an amazing job. You're welding and building submarines. Um, they pay six figures after several years. It's an amazing opportunity. What you don't talk about is that you have to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and you're out in the all elements. And that the welding programs in the district itself don't necessarily prepare you to weld at the shipbuilder, right? So in a lot of ways, I would agree with Monica that the intentions are right. And the idea of really thinking about how to better prepare young people for the opportunities that come after. We develop post-secondary plans for all the students that we work with, right? We need to be thinking in that way. So I think these requirements can push in that direction. It is a little bit too much of the Wild West, I think. It's better, I think, than it was originally. Here in Philadelphia, it's like a lot of kids know how to do CPR in some of those early graduating classes. And again, not a terrible thing, but not a thing that's necessarily going to help their post-secondary outcomes. So I think that there is a real opportunity, but it puts more pressure on the thing that we do not provide kids enough of, which is advice, and good counseling and sort of coordination of our activities. So that needs to happen at a much, much higher level.
Yeah. Just a reminder also for all of our great attendees here, you can submit any questions for the panelists in the Q&A box, and we'll have time pretty soon for those audience questions. But before we get there, I have a few more questions for our panelists because, we know that lawmakers did overhaul these requirements with the idea that they would ensure students are better prepared. But we like don't know if students are any better off. And I've talked to the state about this, and they're not right now even like tracking which credentials students earn towards these requirements. So we don't have much data even. So from your work, Monica and Sean, I'm curious, like, what do you think does make a difference for student success in high school after graduation? Like, there's that kind of counseling, advising, like what else should we be doing more of?
I think a big part, like Sean said, is the counseling and the relationship building that our students know they can have a mentor kind of figure to talk through these things, but also to let our students know that while they're trying to make a decision now for their future, that might change as they go to, and that's okay. And so to setting up some of the ideas of what kind of pathways are out there and how to be resourceful in finding ways to access them is really important because if we honestly look at even the college data, how many students change majors or drop out and don't get that degree? So really giving our students an understanding of what the world can offer in a number of post-secondary areas And then building those relationships, teaching them advocacy, teaching them critical thinking skills, those are far more important and not necessarily a grade on a report card or on their transcript, but those are the things that they will need to be successful regardless of where they go.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think all of that is true. And, as we think about this, right, we'll serve 4,000 kids this year. Across the district in Philadelphia, and we stipend all of our students if they decide to go directly into the workforce or to college. We actually advise and continue to follow them. And so I would underline and maybe put like exclamation points on both sides of the necessity of us being able to provide young people good advice and exposure and opportunities to see and do things that they may not typically do. And then we just have to make it easier for them to pursue their talents and sort of into those job opportunities. I think that it's, kids need licenses to join the trades here, right? Kids, I think as Matt pointed out, some of these are very expensive licenses, and the question is, why do you have a license to go and be a barber? Right? I think that there are, and then I think at the collegiate level where we have many of our students. There is too much paperwork and I think, too much bureaucracy for young people to navigate beyond all the things that they're dealing with on a day-by-day basis. The last thing I would say is that, the difficulty of some of these decisions are to de-emphasize academics, right? So one test at the end of your high school career should not define your future. And at the same time, we still have to academically prepare young people for the opportunities afterwards. We cannot really run away from that, right? Now, it may not be that we should be preparing everybody to take calculus, right? I think that the College for All, focus sometimes, missed out on that everyone does not need actually to be going to, the University of Pennsylvania or some Ivy League school, right? Most people are not going to do that. Everyone does not need to be like, reading at the highest level from an AP class. And at the same time, people need to be prepared no matter what they do. We have a lot of people, myself included, professional folks, who use computers and talk to people all day and are in education, thinking that they understand the pathways for, blue collar work, things that we don't actually totally understand as we build these policies that I think we have to think much harder about. I talk to a lot of funders who are, down on College for All, even though they send all their kids to college. And so we have to be much more, I think, realistic about what this really requires. Because I think going down this path is the right thing to do, but it requires us to be, helping kids make much more complicated, complex decisions. And I don't think we have prepared ourselves to be able to do that.
Yeah, so fascinating. And in some ways helps us understand like this is a newer trend, right? Like it comes after this College for All push and might take some time to build out better systems. And that is what I want to ask you all about now. Like, I in my reporting, I spoke to many teachers who were they were grateful that there was a pathway where students didn't have to pass a standardized test. They were like, not all students are going to do well in those tests. It shouldn't be the end all be all. So they liked the idea of it, but they similarly had some concerns about what's going on currently. So for you folks, like, what do you think is the ideal system for ensuring students are graduation ready? Like, what should policy makers be looking at, and what should students have to do? For anyone.
Yeah, I think we look at this in a couple of different ways. I think, from the young person standpoint, we've embedded our resources. We used to be an out of school time program. We still do a lot of out of school time work, but we embedded our resources in schools. We're in now 20 district schools, 14 of them high schools, six of them middle schools, right? So that we really try to make it as easy as possible to put our resources at the hands of young people. And we really are trying to serve at a high quality level as many kids as we can. We serve about 4,000 now. We want to get to 5,000. We want, we believe in this idea of mass opportunity and putting that right in the hands of young people. Then I think on the policy side, we're really trying to work with the district. We have to think about this, not just like getting kids ready for graduation, right? But that this is really an economic mobility play, right? It is about understanding what employers are looking for and want, understanding what young people are looking for and want, And so we need to be able to build a system that way, which requires much more research, I think, about, using certifications and pathways that actually deliver. In Philly, there are probably about 15,000 kids graduating high school. Every one of those kids, we believe, needs to be connected to an educational or workforce opportunity when they graduate. The good thing about Philly is that that's not 70,000 people, right? It is actually very doable, right? And we need to be thinking in that way, connected to what is actually out in the workforce. A lot of hospitals are not hiring very young people, because they want more seasoned folks to be able to work with people from all over the world who are seeking care in Philly. That's great, but young people, hospitals are one of the main economic drivers here. How are we actually embedding and preparing young people so that maybe they will take a bigger chance on younger folks? Or what's the entry level job that we're going to help prepare them for, that there is a path for them to be able to move up? We need to, right? And nonprofits, the district, and lawmakers need to be thinking in those ways, because that's the way, if we talk about economic mobility being such a big thing in the city, this is one of the ways that we could have an impact on that way, but we have to be thinking much more strategically than we have been.
Monica and Matt, what do you think?
I think to kind of go off of that as well, so much of our economic landscape changes so frequently. And there are so many different systems involved that I agree, Sean, we have to get ahead of it and we need to plan ahead of it, but we also need to educate our communities about it, right? So we have parents of our high schoolers who don't quite know what this graduation pathway is and the importance of it. And so we need to message to them, but we also need to anticipate, I mean, how is AI going to change this landscape? How does that change entry-level jobs? How does minimum wage change entry-level jobs? All of that really plays into it too. And it's hard because I don't think we're fortune tellers and we can't really tell where we're going to be in 5 years, but also being strategic in noticing the gifts and the talents in our students, how they're hardwired for different industries and interests, and really feeding into that so that we can kind of adjust as our landscape adjusts.
Yeah, this is a $1 billion question, right? Of like, how do we prepare students for life after high school and what skills should they have? Um, I mean, I think Sean mentioned this. I don't think you can escape foundational literacy and numeracy skills and academic achievement. I think in whatever path students pursue, they will be better off and better able to thrive in their future. And I do worry that we've sacrificed a bit of that in the current design of the IBC policy in terms of making substitutes. I also think ensuring that students have plans that are realistic and informed is good, but also the best laid plans, right? We know that pathways are not linear, that career pathways are not linear, educational pathways are not linear, right? So, giving students a set of skills that allow some adaptability and changeability is, I think, really important because life throws wrenches and you need to be able to kind of pivot along the way. Um, and I think the other thing that I would say is I think students need more opportunities. Once again, as Sean said, I'm basically just saying everything Sean said. I'm not contributing much to this conversation, but like you can learn about a career in a book or whatever in a classroom. It's very different to get out into the field and to shadow someone and to have a mentor from that company and to experience work-based learning, or ideally to get a formal apprenticeship where you're getting paid, but also getting extended training over a period of time. And of course, many countries have far more developed systems of apprenticeship and work-based training than we do. And I think we just need to provide more of those opportunities for students, maybe not signing ninth graders up for a singular pathway that they have to pursue their entirety of high school. Maybe it's kind of like a sprinkling of different opportunities that we're able to provide students, but to combine the academic learning with the real world hands-on experiences to allow a student to see like, oh, I can actually see myself in this type of job, right? Like you might love studying medicine and hate blood. And then you probably shouldn't be a phlebotomist or a nurse or something. It might not be the best career path for you, but you might not know that until you're in an ER or in a hospital and actually like trying to treat patients. So I think the more that we can, once students start progressing through high school, give them those real world career experiences combined with the like advising and mentorship, I think is absolutely critical, particularly for the students who might not want to pursue higher education directly after high school.
Got it. And I'm going to move to our audience questions because we have something very related to this, but folks can keep submitting to the Q&A box if you have more. But someone is asking what can be done to update the curriculum and assessment so they relate to what students need to be able to do in the future. Because I think we're talking a lot about like support systems and exposure, but like there is a lot of assessment that's still done in high school. There is curriculum requirements. So what can happen there? And this question can be for anyone, but Monica, how about you start us off?
Yeah, so when you look at the Keystone, particularly for Pennsylvania, since that's what we're talking about, right? Keystone exams required are English, math, typically after Algebra 1, and biology. And so we're talking about reading comprehension, reading skills, numeracy skills, not calculus, Algebra 1, and then biology. And so a lot of it is based on the skills that our students should have, regardless of where they graduate. We're talking about reading, writing, math skills, critical thinking skills. So I do think that we're headed, that we are there, right? But we also have to add in these workplace readiness kind of situations as well. Um, and our Keystone exam scores are still low, right? Especially in Philadelphia. So what that's telling me is if these tests are not testing a high level of skill, we're not at the calculus level of skill, and yet our students are underperforming on these Keystone tests, there could be a number of reasons for that. We do have to look backwards, right? We need to start preparing, looking at curriculum differently in the elementary grades on up. It can't just be a high school situation. And COVID did throw wrenches in things, and there's a lot of other systems involved in the education system that also throw wrenches. I don't know that the test is wrong or that it's looking at wrong skills. I just think there's more to it in understanding the test scores, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And it's interesting to hear that. We have more audience questions, but Sean or Matt, do you have any other thoughts on assessment? Okay, well, we got more to dig into here. So, Matt, someone wants to know what can we learn from other states? Like, is there a proof point state for high school graduation requirements where they're like really doing things really, really well, the way that like Mississippi is held up as an example for literacy? Um,
That's a good question. So just I'll mention some states and what they have going on, but North Carolina has had a tiered system for IBCs for a while. So they've spent a lot of time thinking about, what's the different value of different types of certifications. There might be the kind of short-term, online, open book. Teacher goes in the classroom, tells kids to open their Chromebook and complete a certification during the class period. Those probably aren't as valuable as the ones that take more effort and skill and training to obtain. So Texas recently just proposed a tiering system, and I noticed a question in the chat about that also, but essentially they've reviewed a lot of data on the relationship between the certifications and students' labor outcomes, as well as thinking about the occupations that are high skill and high wage, and which certifications are actually being used by employers, and looking at things like job postings, right? To see like, are employers actually considering these certifications in their hiring? To try to come up with a system that better kind of tiers. So that's one way that states have done it. Other states like Ohio have basically combined the tiering system with the graduation requirements. So in Ohio, um, the system, if I recall correctly, is students need to earn 12 points through industry certifications to meet that type of graduation requirement, right? That can be done through like one 12-point certification that's really robust, or 12 one-point certifications, which is a little more random. And that's when students are getting the CPR and maybe OSHA 10 and maybe this one, the ones that they kind of are often viewed as like foundational to a wide range of occupations. But they have also found that there were instances of schools essentially combining the lowest hanging fruit certifications into a little 12-point bundle and ensuring all students are obtaining that bundle. So they're also currently undergoing some revisions of essentially removing some of the certifications from the list, changing the point values, so on and so forth. And I think they'll be coming up with a new system in the near future. The other thing that I just say that Texas and other states has done, as I kind of alluded to previously, is just removing certifications from the list, right? So if we realize that, once again, in theory, this was a good idea, in practice, it's being used to game the system and just kind of pumping the certifications out for all students, but it's not actually helping them in the future, take it off the list, right? Maybe it's not the best idea of just promoting that so heavily. And I credit Texas for basically recognizing dozens of certifications where that was kind of the pattern that they were seeing and basically removing those from the list. So I don't know if I would say one state is doing it right and all the rest are doing it wrong, but I think we're learning from all the experimentation in different states and kind of slowly figuring out which policies work better than others.
And is that something you're seeing, like, is it State Department of Eds are just taking interest in this? Is it political or going to the state legislature anywhere?
It varies. Sometimes the legislature is coming up with the list. Sometimes the legislature charges the state education agency with coming up with the list. Sometimes the governor's office is actually heavily involved. I've seen that in some states. For example, in Ohio, Ohio also has a system where they have certain credentials that they incentivized and other ones that they didn't. They call them IWhip credentials. I forget what IWhip stands for. But the governor basically allocated some funding to say if students are in these really high value certifications, we'll give schools a bonus, right? But it wasn't all the certifications on the list, it was just certain ones. So in that case, it was like the governor using some funding mechanism to prioritize what was perceived to be kind of high value certifications. Also, in some states, the workforce commissions are involved in addition to the K-12 agency, and it makes a lot of sense for the workforce commission to be involved as well.
Mm.
Finally, I'll just mention that there's a group called Advanced CTE that has done some really great work in this space, and they've also done a landscape analysis of all of the states and the different like IBC policies that they have, including the lists that exist for educational purposes. And some states have like a single list of certifications that students should earn. And some states have like 10 different lists, each from a different office or agency. And it's a total mess, and no one knows which ones are valuable and which ones aren't. And there needs to be a lot of complication there. So I don't know about Pennsylvania specifically, but I think we're also learning about how to make these approaches more coherent, streamlined, and coordinated across the various agencies that might want to be involved in helping to prepare students for career.
So fascinating. Yeah, from what I remember in my reporting, the state, Pennsylvania has a state list that is put together by the Department of Ed under like the CTE office, but then districts are allowed to add things to it.
Yeah,
And
Rebecca, I was going to kind of jump off of what Matt was saying too. And so in Pennsylvania, there are 5 graduation pathways. The third pathway is the CTE pathway, right? So those are the state recognized CTE programs and credentials. And then on pathway 5, which is evidence-based pathway, that's where the non-CTE IRCs are. And so that's where each district has been able to make their non-CTE list. And so it is almost like you were talking about that 12-point system, right? You could have a 12-point that would be the CTE big ones where you're going to school for that, versus the smaller ones that are non-CTE. But what each district is noticing is that when they had to make their non-CTE industry recognized credential list, it was like step ladder safety. No, we don't need that. You know, they upgraded that to articulated ladder safety, but still, do we really need that? Those kinds of questions. If you're going to construction, absolutely. But if you're not, then we're just checking a box.
Yeah. So one of the attendees, someone named Sean, asks about that kind of like gaming the system that can happen to gain credentials that like might not be aligned to what a student wants to do, but is like easy to get. So with that kind of phenomenon, Monica and Sean, I'm curious if you have insight into this. Like, do you view the issue as embedded within the requirement in the policy itself? Or is there something with the policy design that's like leading to that kind of gaming the system situation?
I mean, and I think Monica's, in the thick of it. I would say, from a distance about what we do. I mean, if you ever met a high school student, you're trying to find the path of least resistance. And I also think, um, when you have a sort of unfunded mandates, right? If you think about the complexity of what we're talking about, to really have a conversation about, well, really, you should do this program that's going to take you more time when we probably have the least amount of hold on you, right? And a thing you're not sure you want to do, right? You may end up going into the space, or a school has to operate, right? There, let's say a CTE high school in the city has to operate multiple programs with a lot of different kinds of certifications that are available. Kids have to pass the NOCT, which is that test at the end of the so you are doing something very complex. And so, maybe the CPR is like the easiest thing to do so kids can graduate. And when we sort of abstractly get into the idea of graduation versus like what does the kid really know and what does that connect with where they're going to go, I think it's not surprising, right? And I think you could talk about gaming the system, and you could also sort of naturally say, this is really hard to do, so people are going to do the easiest version of this, because they think that's what's possible.
I could not agree more. Teenagers, young people, give me 30 minutes, don't give me 30 hours. Um, and I think too, when you look at Pathway 5 in Pennsylvania, for the evidence-based pathway, there are two sections. So your three pieces of evidence, you have to have one piece of evidence from section 1. And so section 1 contains things like ACT work keys test scores, SAT subject test scores, AP test scores, IB test scores. For students like mine who are test averse and struggling academically, those are already off the table for them in their minds. Or it's acceptance into an institute of higher education without needing remedial classes, which again, for my students, that's a test. You have to take the AccuPlacer. So then we're down to post-secondary and dual enrollment, money, time, right? Or industry recognized credentials. That's your section 1. So you have to have at least one piece of evidence from there. So we have to push at least one industry recognized credential. And so I think if we really focus on making sure that industry recognized credential is related to the student's career of choice and their skill set, then we're doing well. Because the section 2 are more the lower hanging fruit. It could be a letter guaranteeing full-time employment. It could be a service learning project, which in the city of Philadelphia is a 10-hour service learning project. It could be an internship or an externship. Internship's about 50 hours. Externship could be 10 to 15 hours. So they are smaller kind of projects, but we have to get at least one of those industry recognized credentials. And so I think it goes back to, are we counseling our students? Are we really being intentional? But then again, on the Philadelphia industry recognized credential list, I could do an OSHA 10, which is a 10-hour course, and there's a cost, it's like $35, $40 per student. Or I can get my pilot's license for $22,000. That's an option, right? And a lot more time. And yes, it's a great career. And if my student is absolute about doing that, I can't afford $22,000 per student, but somebody could, right? But you have to be intentional. But then as a business, I also need to I need to make this work financially for my students as well. So that's the hard part.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to me because the pathways are like, it's like 5 different pathways and different things fill the requirements of each one. But then when you really look at it, you're like, oh, most of these requirements are tests in some kind of form, be it a standardized test or SAT score or AP score. So there's actually only this like tiny little bucket that's not test related still. Okay, we have more wonderful audience questions. From Josiah, they ask, what are specific licenses or career programs that you have seen are helpful or desirable for high schoolers? Um, Matt, do you have insight on that?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think that I've seen I've seen the healthcare ones often are some of the best and by best, I mean coherent, students complete coursework aligned with the credentials, and typically the programs are related to both college going and earnings, right? So I mean, healthcare is often held up as like it's a career pathway, and you start as a certified nursing assistant, and you can be a licensed vocational nurse, then a registered nurse, then a nurse practitioner, and it's much more kind of coherent and stackable compared to other pathways. But we have seen those work really well, and yeah, both the coursework and the credentials are positively related to students' post-secondary outcomes. For a lot of the pathways, I'll say that there's often, with the exception of healthcare and nursing, there's sometimes a trade-off between relationships with labor outcomes and relationships with college going and college success, right? So, for example, fields and or pathways in transportation, in construction, in manufacturing, often are positively associated with like first year wage gains, but inversely related to college going. And some of that is selection bias. I'm not suggesting necessarily these are causal effects, but it's kind of a trade-off, right, between like short-term labor market benefits, but potentially long-term inverse relationships, particularly if it's decreasing the likelihood that students pursue post-secondary education. But if we are just focused on like the initial transition into the labor market, there are those pathways in those subjects, even pathways like cosmetology, which was one of the most controversial pathways and certifications in Texas. There was lots of politicking about cosmetology that was like very fascinating to me. And there was a time that it was not going to be on the list of approved industry-based certifications. And then my research suggests that cosmetology licenses are strongly related to first year earnings. And of course, it's like a really important job in many communities, right? So, even ones that we don't necessarily associate with like, oh, the tech revolution and advanced manufacturing and, complex welding occupations, even some of those can still be like great professions that prepare students for transitions into good jobs that pay well out of high school. Anyway, so I don't know if that helps or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and I have a question now. I'm going to put it to Sean and Monica as from Cynthia and Megan in the audience. They're saying that meaningful student guidance and support takes a lot of staff knowledge and skill. Um, that makes sense, right? It takes a lot of time and just like thoughtful teachers to help with students understanding what their next steps could be. So like they ask, how do we tackle this, especially with already strained counseling capacity, already strained teaching capacity, and is there a role for technology in this, maybe?
Yeah, and I think, when we look at it from our standpoint, our career readiness hits on 3 points. It's this readiness, exploration, preparation, and application. And what we've tried to do with our staff, we have a career team, and I think, as we've been building out this work over time, the career team had the big burden of really driving all of our career work, right? What we have understood now is our coordinators who are based in the schools need to have a level of career knowledge that we did not really think about when we first started doing this work several years ago, as a merged organization. And we are now really putting that back on our school-based staff to actually own career preparation and expand their knowledge base, right? We have a lot of people who understand education and education pathways, right? We understand college, we understand going into those career pathways. We are now really training our staff to really understand, what career pathways mean and helping them, and not just being on the burden of the career team, right? So I think more general education is really important. We have a college app course that we designed with the University of Pennsylvania that then also takes our knowledge around college and place it in classrooms so that you can use it for senior seminars. We're designing something similar around career, right? So I think to that point in the question about technology, there are ways to use the technology of the school, which is the classroom, right, in ways that I think are more fundamental than even chasing a kid down during lunch hour or getting them to come to some counseling sessions that we probably could do a better job of. And there are organizations on the country, doing work that way. I think that the other piece is that I would always advocate for this, both because it's the work that we do. There just need to be more counselors and there need to be more differentiated ways of support, right? Guidance counselors now are doing behavioral health, they are filling in like lunchroom duty, and they are doing academic preparation, and they are preparing for post-secondary. And in Philadelphia, it's like there's one counselor to 600 students. And in a lot of ways, in a profession that's not always respected, like the counselors are even less respected, even though it is even more important. All the things that we've talked about this whole time have been about the complexity of navigating systems. And then we're also asking very young people, at the beginning of their careers and their lives to make big, huge decisions with like virtually nobody able to give them advice, right? And I think we need to fundamentally as a country invest more in doing that and respect that because I think, if kids trust someone, they will listen, right? And I think the opportunity to help them navigate the decisions the road is not, clear as Matt talked about, right? These places are not going to be linear, but they, could be helpful, much more helpful to students than we have been.
Monica, what about what you see at One Bright Ray?
Yeah, I
Um,
absolutely agree that manpower is always a struggle. And so at One Bright Ray, we have small school environments. Our largest school has 270 students, but we are intentional with our counselors. So we have one college and career counselor, but that is separate from our emotional support team counselor. So we have one dealing with the behavior and then one dealing with the post-secondary. We also have social workers and youth mentors and things like that as well. But I totally agree. It's also about educating our teams on what is happening now. Because when I went to college, a long time ago, it was all about college. And so now it's not about college anymore. It's about college and other career aspects. And so constantly being educated on what is available and where is our world going, and also listening to our students, listening to their passions and their desires. I have a lot of students who want to be entrepreneurs. Like that's what they want to do. They want to have their own clothing lines. That's what they see, and seeing how we can tap into that and those skill sets and set them up for success. So I really do think manpower is really important, but also constantly evaluating where we are and where we're headed in our society and how we can help our students grow into that.
yeah, I mean, things feel like they're changing so fast, and so the advising makes sense, has to change with it. Well, that is the end of our hour almost, and so I want to just thank everyone in the audience for joining us. A huge thank you to our panelists. This was like so insightful. It's so great to chat with all of you. Everyone can be on the lookout for a survey when you exit. It'll just take 2 minutes, and it helps us better understand what makes a great virtual event. And yeah, thank you again for joining us. You can sign up for Chalkbeat Philadelphia's newsletter to stay up to date. You can email me if you have more questions and thoughts on this. Yeah, it's been great to chat. Have a great Tuesday, everyone.
And read Rebecca's article on this topic if you haven't yet. I'm
Yeah.
sure everyone has, but it was a great article,
Yes, it was.
excellent reporting, continue doing good work, and pleasure to be with y'all.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take
Thank
care.
you.